This is Philosophy Bites with me, David Edmonds.
And me, Nigel Warburton.
Philosophy Bites is available at www.philosophybites.com. Gamble on God. If he exists, and you don't believe in him, you may end up in eternal damnation. If he doesn't exist, well, you've lost very little. It's a fair bet that you've heard of Pascal's wager. It was set out in his posthumously published thoughts, the Pensées. But Ben Rogers, author of a book on Pascal, says the French 17th century genius ought to be celebrated also for his penetrating analysis of the human condition.
Ben Rogers, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Thank you. Hello.
We're going to focus on Blaise Pascal's Pensées. I wonder if you could begin by saying who Blaise Pascal was.
Pascal was born in 1623, and he was recognised even in his own life as a sort of preeminent scientist, mathematician. We now don't take so much notice of his scientific achievements, and he's really remembered above all for the Pensées, which he wrote a few years before his death in 1662.
We shouldn't pass over his scientific achievement because he did make an amazing calculating machine, didn't he?
He did. He was both, I suppose, unusual even in his own day in being both an extraordinary mathematician but also an experimenter, and a great gift for creating things, and a very practical turn of mind.
But he was also highly religious, and that's a force that comes through the Pensées, his thoughts. Let's begin by saying how they came to be written.
Well, Pascal was, as you said, a very religious man. I think he was born to a religious family, he was brought up to be fairly devout, but underwent a series of conversions and became more and more religious throughout his life. And he had one particularly momentous conversion in 1654, which really was a sort of profound, ecstatic experience. And in fact, he wrote down the experience on a sheet of parchment which he carried sewn into his clothes for the rest of his life. And shortly after that, he became embroiled in a polemic against the Jesuits, who he thought represented a very sort of lax form of Catholicism, and he defended a much more austere, almost puritanical version of Catholicism. Having written the provincial letters in which he defended the Jansenists, which was the movement he was associated with against the Jesuits, he then set out to write an apology, a defence of the Christian religion. And the Pensées, as we know them today, came out of that. He would write down his thoughts on large pieces of paper. He would then cut them up and organise them in bundles, which he then threaded together. He never had time to finish the apology or indeed take it very far before he became really too ill to work. And when he died, his family and his followers published the Pensées, but in a way which was not at all sensitive to the order in which Pascal had left them. It's only over the last 50 or 60 years that scholars have begun to piece together the original order of the Pensées, and actually the Pensées as we know them today, almost 1,000 fragments, are very close to the order in which Pascal left them.
Given the strange nature of this book, there's lots of fragments sewn together essentially by different editors. How do we go about reading it?
Yeah, good question and a difficult one. I think there's two tendencies which must be resisted. One is just to read them as individual fragments. There is a tendency to sometimes asceticize them and think of them as being a sort of Nietzsche, just an aphorist. And what we actually have here are notes towards a finished work. The other extreme, what we must also resist, is actually viewing it as a finished apology, because he never did finish it. And who knows, maybe actually he didn't not finish it because he was ill. Maybe he didn't finish it because he just had given up on it. It was too hard a challenge. But what we can do from the fragments that have been left behind, and some of the fragments refer to the structure of the work, and then there's the ordering of the fragments as well, gives us quite a good clue as to how Pascal was thinking about the plan of his work. We can understand it in that way, as long as we don't go too far down that road.
Okay, well, let's try and get a sense of the main themes of the book. How would you outline the main thrust of this work?
This is an apology for the Christian religion. It's addressed to a sort of sceptical, worldly, perhaps conventionally Christian, but not heartfelt Christian. And he wanted to bring these people to God, convince them of the truth of Christianity. And he did not believe in the sort of Cartesian approach. Remember, he was born a generation after Descartes. His father had been a friend of Descartes. But Descartes attempted to prove the existence of God through a series of deductions, essentially. And Pascal thought this was entirely misconceived and never actually really persuade anyone. And ultimately, the God you ended up with wasn't even the Christian God, essentially. It was a sort of a deity. Pascal adhered to a very, very Christocentric form of Christianity. He thought that we weren't able to know God directly. We were only able to know him through Jesus Christ. So the point of the apology is to sort of convince people of the truths of the Christian religion. And very roughly, the Pensées fall into two parts. In the first part, there's a portrait of man. And the second part, there's an argument as to the truth of the Christian religion.
So let's look at the portrait of man. How does he paint humanity?
Well, the portrait of man is, to most of us today, by far the most interesting half of the Pensées. I mean, it's an extraordinarily sort of rich and deliberately contradictory portrait, full of sort of clashing elements. And the idea is actually to build up a picture of man which is so sort of rich that it can't be accounted for in human terms alone, and can only really be accounted for in using a sort of Christian framework. So that is the essential argument. And the way that Pascal does this is that he does it by playing off different schools of thought. And that's why you get all these different sort of voices going on. And it's very dangerous with the Pensées of taking any one thought as an expression of Pascal's views. In fact, he's playing off one philosophical sect against another.
Could you give some examples of that?
Yes, I think one of their sort of central divisions within the Pensées is between philosophical skeptics and philosophical sort of Stoics and dogmatists. Philosophical skeptics, represented, say, by Montaigne, take a very low view of human capacity and human nature. They're skeptics about what we can know, but they're also skeptics about our powers to attain a sort of invincible virtue. And then you've got another school represented by Descartes, for example, or by Epictetus, who Pascal calls sometimes dogmatists or sometimes rationalists, who have a very high view of what we can attain. They believe that we have this extraordinary capacity for knowledge. They advocate a very sort of high-minded, strenuous virtue. And Pascal plays these off against each other, showing that both are true and neither are true. Well, how do we account for this? We account for this with the fact that man has elements of greatness in him which distinguishes him from the animals. He can think. At the same time, he is feeble. And the fall ultimately will explain that, the fact that we were made in God's image and then descended essentially to become sort of fallen corporal creatures.
On my superficial reading, the parts of the book where Pascal is describing the wretchedness of humanity, he relishes, he loves describing how we're driven by lust and greed. He doesn't celebrate reason with the same degree of relish, I feel.
Oh, well, I mean, there are passages where he quite emphatically opposes someone like Montaigne and saying, yes, but you ignore the fact that we might be feeble, but we can think. And that's very important. In fact, Pascal, as just a matter of biographical fact, had an enormous respect, of course, for intellectual and scientific achievement. And here we come actually to a very important sort of structuring scheme of all of Pascal's thought, which is this idea of the three orders.
Okay, so what are the three orders?
Well, the three orders are body, mind and heart. These sort of inform Pascal's thinking throughout in lots of different ways. I mean, he thinks we are, in a sense, as humans, belong to all three orders at once. So animals just belong to the bodily order. We have a mind. We also have a heart. There are three different ways of forms of knowledge that these offer. So there's the senses, there's reason, and then there's intuition. And all offer real knowledge for Pascal. And then there are also three forms of leadership or greatness with respect to these orders. So an athlete is a prince of material world, but so is a king. Then you have the princes of the intellectual world, who are the scientists, the philosophers, and then you have the princes of the world of the heart, who is the church fathers, and ultimately Christ.
That's interesting. So the heart is the organ with which you relate to God, not the mind, because Descartes, for instance, would have wanted you to relate with your mind.
Absolutely right. You know God ultimately through your heart. It's an intuition. But Pascal also says that there are other things that we know through our intuition. His answer to the skeptics who cast doubt on everything is actually we can't rationally prove that time exists, that we exist, that the external world exists, but we know it through these intuitions. And similarly, the other forms of knowledge also have their place in the religious life. A devout person will know God through the heart, but will also read the scriptures and that way use their mind to appraise themselves of the truth of Christianity. They'll also repeatedly take part in the sacraments, which is a sort of bodily engagement.
So you said earlier there are lots of different opposing points of view being brought into play. Could you give a few more examples of those?
Yeah, another really important one is a distinction between the philosophers and the people. On the one hand, Pascal is dividing the philosophers into two groups, skeptics and dogmatists, but he also recognises a certain family resemblance among all the philosophers, and he contrasts that or juxtaposes that against the people. So there's a sort of view amongst all philosophers of the time that the people were ignorant and they were vain, and that only philosophy could lead you to the truth. And Pascal endorses that, and then he undermines it. One example would be attaining happiness and a good life. So the philosophers laughed at the common people who spent their time chasing after worldly goods, playing, gambling, fox hunting and so forth. And they said, what an absurd way to be happy. The way to be happy is to fortify yourself against fortune, to be sort of meditative and reflective. Pascal sort of endorses that in the early stages of the Pensées. And he has particular fun at the common people who spend their days chasing a hare, which they wouldn't want if they could get it. Then he turns the tables on the philosophers and said, well, of course they do that, because the alternative is sitting in a room and contemplating your own wretched condition. And that's the sort of dynamic that's being played out throughout the Pensées. And it's really to show that there's actually no point of view that we humans can sort of attain through secular philosophy, which is really sort of strong and able to guarantee us happiness. Our predicament, until we embrace Christianity, is one of both sort of ignorance and unhappiness and wretchedness.
So this portrait of man is the first part of the book, and it's quite a complex portrait because it's pulling in different directions. But what takes us from that to the second part of the book?
Well, we end up with it towards the end of that portrait is a depiction of a creature with this extraordinarily rich collection of qualities. He's both great and wretched. He has extraordinarily intellectual potential, and yet he's very much a sort of corporal object. He is neither big nor small, neither finite or infinite. This is meant to be a sort of very unsettling depiction. It's meant to sort of really disturb the reader. What Pascal is doing, in a sense, is sort of softening the reader up for Christianity.
So human beings are neither one thing nor the other. We still haven't got to God yet. My inclination would be to say the argument of the wager is what gets us there. That's the bit of the book that every philosophy student knows.
That's right. So we are neither one thing nor the other. Though what Pascal's done already by the end of the portrait is to establish we do have all these very real attributes. How do we put them together? How do we make sense of them? Where do they come from? And you're right, the wager probably is an important part of that argument.
You better remind us what the wager is.
It's a bet. Basically, Pascal says we can't know whether God exists or not, and we can't even say whether it's more probable that God does exist or doesn't, because we know so little about his nature. He is infinite. He's absolutely beyond our understanding. At the same time, what we do know is that if God does exist and we have believed in him, then the rewards are infinitely great. If we believe in him and it turns out that he doesn't exist, well, all we've done is spent a good life, been devout, helped others, no harm done. And those circumstances, it's absolutely rational to bet on God's existence. That's the wager. It is hugely controversial amongst logicians. There's one common criticism that we can defend Pascal against, and that is it sometimes said, well, all that Pascal's done is shown you that it's rational to believe in God. That actually can't make you believe in God. And Pascal understands that very clearly. And his argument is, well, as a first step to believing in God, you have to try to believe in God. You then begin to examine in a much more sympathetic light the case for Christianity, and you begin taking part in all these bodily exercises. You start going to Mass, you start praying. And Pascal thought that actually just bodily practice had an effect on belief.
So basically this is a gambler's argument. Gamble on the existence of God, because if you win you get a huge prize, infinite happiness, and if you lose you burn in hell possibly. And if you gamble on God existing and he doesn't exist, it's not such a huge loss. So a rational gambler is going to choose God. But then if you have trouble believing in God, just go through the motions. It's kind of reverse method acting. You pretend that you believe in God and then the belief comes afterwards.
That's right. And actually there's a sort of dig there, I suppose, at the very high-minded sort of forms of religion, perhaps Cartesian religion, which sees religion all about the mind, when in fact, as Pascal is saying, it's actually just about the body as well.
It seems to me, from what you've been saying, that the whole structure of this book relies on us believing that humanity is fallen, that the different elements within a human being arise both because we're made in the shape of God and because we've fallen from grace in some way. Now, if you don't believe that, if you don't take the metaphysical underpinning that comes from Christianity, what's left?
What's left is an extraordinarily rich, timeless portrait of human nature, actually. If we think about philosophical debates today, Pascal has a contribution to make to most of them, as we're thinking about the distinction between sort of mind and body. All of Pascal's reflections on our nature as both spiritual beings or beings with sort of mental attributes and bodily. That's a sort of extraordinarily sort of rich territory. I think likewise his sort of reflections on happiness, or indeed his reflections on the role of intuition in knowledge. These are sort of deep perennial issues, and Pascal makes this really profound contribution. I think he's quite a profound political philosopher. I think above all he's a sort of critic of the philosophical tradition itself and its sort of conceits.
What did Pascal have against philosophy then?
Well, Pascal was a skeptic about systems. He thought there was no sort of system, no purely secular system, that could capture the complexity of reality. And wherever he detected a sort of system maker, and I think most philosophers are system makers, he wanted to have a go and undermine them. And that's really one of the great strengths of this book. It's a perpetual sort of warring against some of the pretensions of the system builders.
The way you've presented Pascal, he's a fascinating thinker. Why do you think he's been so neglected by philosophers?
Well, I think that's a good question. I wish he was better known, but I think it's true to say that while he's very well known in France and has always been an important influence over French philosophy, he's not much studied by English-speaking philosophers. One reason is it's very, very hard. It's also the case that there's been a sort of revolution in our understanding of Pascal over the last couple of generations, and I just think that Anglophone philosophy hasn't caught up with that, and I really wish it would, because in my view he should be one of the central figures of the canon. Pascal was a sort of supreme genius. You're in the hands of a Shakespeare or a Plato or one of these people who just crosses so much and has absorbed so much and you really feel has a position on everything. And if you're like me and spend many years reading Pascal, you do sort of walk around with a sort of Pascalian frame, this ability to think, what would Pascal make of that? And there's almost always an answer to that.
Ben Rogers, thank you very much.
Thank you.